This is Identity Part 2. We're going to talk about self-conceptions and the changes that happen. Picking right up where we left off in our last video, talking about those 3 approaches that researchers use to study how a person's sense of identity starts to change during adolescence, we're really going to concentrate on that first one, changing a person's self-concepts. Your book starts off by reiterating the fact, and I thought it would be good to do as well, that adolescents and children have vast differences in the way that they do 2 things that relates mainly to self-concept. The first one is their ability to understand abstract concepts, and the second one is processing large amounts of information. Neither of these 2 things should be a surprise to you, as in Biological Transitions module, we talked about those brain changes and how it allows an adolescent to actually process things in multiple dimensions. And we also talked about processing speed. And then in our cognitive transitions, we really talked about how we change from that concrete operational way of thinking into that formal operations way of thinking, if we're speaking on Piagetian terms, that is. And so we're able to understand that once we reach into adolescence. So what do these abilities have to do with what we're talking about? Well, it's because of these abilities that an adolescent is able to better characterize themselves. A child describes themselves in very simple terms. I'm a nice person. My favorite color is purple. I love art class, right? But an adolescent uses much more complex, abstract, psychological self-characterizations. Comparing again to children, adolescents are more likely to describe what they're like in different situations. And again, unlike children, they're more aware of who's doing this describing. They are. It's a self-description. So they use these more specific, more complex descriptions than a child does, which, the child does these very blanket overall generalizations. And an adolescent is also able to recognize that they may come across differently to different people in different situations, and they're very sensitive to others' opinions. Adolescents are likely to organize and integrate different aspects into their self-concept, and they do this in a very logical, coherent, kind of whole gestalt manner. Remember gestalt from general psychology? The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You look at the whole picture instead. So they're able to integrate different aspects into their self-concept. But this can be hard because adolescents can recognize but not quite understand their inconsistencies or contradictions in their own personality. They begin to recognize their own faults, their own weaknesses. So how do they resolve this? Well, they make their concept much more complicated. Complex and clear self-concepts are actually associated with lower levels of anxiety and depression. Another consequence of adolescents' recognition that they're not always consistent with their personality concerns their ability to distinguish between their true self and their false self, or between their authentic self and inauthentic self. And behavior that intentionally presents a false impression to other people, we call that a false self behavior. You know it's not your true self, but you act that way anyway. And we see this happen a lot in young romantic relationships. I thought of an example that I want to share with you. Albeit a personal and anecdotal example, still an example. When I was in my adolescence, a long time ago, I really, really liked this boy that skateboarded. And I thought, well, I can do that. I can be a skater girl, right? And this was before skater girls were a thing, before Avril Lavigne. And so I said, I can do this. So I went out and I got myself a cheap skateboard and I started learning. That wasn't who I was. Maybe it's who I became, but definitely who wasn't who I was. I started listening to music I didn't listen to and told him, oh yeah, I know that band. Totally know that band. And then I would go to the record store and I would look up that band and I would buy 3 albums of that band and I would go home and listen to that band. That wasn't who I was, and I knew that that wasn't who I was, but that was the front I put on. Adolescents, they don't like false self-behavior, but they also believe that sometimes it's okay to do. And when you ask an adolescent why they do it, you get a variety of different answers, and adolescents do it to different degrees as well. There is a reciprocal relationship between false self-behavior and self-esteem. The more you have false behavior, the lower your self-esteem is. And the lower your self-esteem is, the more false self-behavior you have. Before we get into talking about this last part about dimensions and personality, I thought it would be good to do a little review, just in case it's been a little while since you've taken general psychology, or maybe you took personality theories with another instructor or something like that. I thought a good review would be nice. So this is my slide that I use in my general psychology class, all about the Big Five theory. We call this the five-factor model, or the Big Five, and we remember it with the word ocean. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So openness is if you're high in openness, and all of these listed here are kind of what it's like if you're high in the dimension. This means that you're open to new things, you try new experiences, you read a lot, you immerse yourself, you try a new recipe, you are constantly, hey, skydiving, sure, I'll go do that, whatever, right? Like, that's high in openness. You can be low in openness, you can be somewhere in between. All of these, okay? Conscientiousness is the care a person gives to organization and thoughtfulness of others, if they're dependable, things like that. Extroversion is the need to be with other people, not necessarily to be social, but just to be around other people. And obviously the opposite side of that is introversion. Nothing wrong with either way. Agreeableness is the emotional style that a person has, like being friendly or easygoing or likable, all the way down to being grumpy, crabby, and unpleasant. I always think about agreeableness. I think of the movie Up, the Pixar Disney movie Up. Mr. Fredricksen is low in agreeableness, and Russell is high in agreeableness. And then neuroticism. To be high in neuroticism means you have emotional instability. To be low means you have emotional stability. So now that we kind of covered that, I think that it's good to talk about what this looks like in adolescence. So the five-factor model, that was a mouthful. The five-factor model was actually designed for adults, but it has been successful in extending into adolescence. There are genetic and environmental influences on dimensions of personality, and environment becomes a much more important influence as we age. In general, these traits are influenced by those two things. But we also see that there's very strong links between early temperament and adolescent personality. Do you remember temperament? Temperament is almost like a personality of a baby, right? We have easy, difficult, and slow to warm up temperament. Is there this huge upheaval of personality dimensions like there is in the movies, and like I showed those books, remember at the beginning of that one module we talked about adolescent stereotypes? Is that really how it is? No. Pretty much personality is quite stable throughout the lifetime. So this graph from your book, there is some evidence that shows that between adolescence and young adulthood, we start to see small shifts in these 5 dimensions of personality. For example, individuals on average become less extroverted, more conscientious, more agreeable, and more emotionally stable. But on a whole, a person's basic personality remains stable from high school all the way into their mid-60s, when we actually do see a small shift. Especially with respect to maturity, aesthetic appreciation, tidiness, social sensitivity, those aspects. And that's going to conclude this video.